It's very interesting, whatever fact that, little bit of fact that he has shared. I am very intrigued and I'm very sure that you guys are going to enjoy everything that he has to share. So enjoy, and I'll let him take over. So take it away. I'll turn these lights off, but I'll turn the side lights on so you get better effect. Hence, we don't want to add to the light pollution. So enjoy.
Hi everybody. Just a little bit of background on me and how I got involved in this. We lived up on Mapleton Avenue, and we were there for 50 years. And we had a turf farm behind us. And when you would stand out on our deck, you would have thought that the turf farm was part of our lawn. It looked like it went forever. And back in 1999, the turf farmer decided to move to South Carolina and retired, and he sold the property to a developer who put in 17 nice houses. But the one thing that I didn't want was glare. I didn't want to be at the back of the house looking out there at glare. So I worked with the developer, and he actually brought me the unit that they were going to use for the outdoor lighting. And it still had the tag on it for the manufacturer and the model number. And we hooked it up on our deck and went over to where he was building his first house, and it was horrendous. It had tons of glare because the light was actually exposed directly. And so I called up the manufacturer the next day and I said, what about putting the light inside the black metal crown at the top? And he says, oh yeah, we do that all the time, you just have to ask us. So I went back to the developer. He said, sure, no problem, right? And all of a sudden the problem went away. So for me, light pollution has been something I've been involved in for about 25 years. I've worked with the state legislature. We've got 4 state statutes passed now on outdoor lighting and 1 state building code amendment. So let's take a look. So for billions of years, there was basically just bright days and dark nights. There was no artificial light at all. And one of the questions here is, to what degree is there a human right to see the majesty of the stars? When you go out to the areas of the Four Corners where your Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona meet, it's really, really dark there, and you see spectacular scenes of the sky. But here on the East Coast, even in the best places in Connecticut, it's what we'll call good, as opposed to really excellent. I think I skipped one. So 146 years ago, we came out with the electric light bulb. They had gas lights and things like that, but this was the advent of what we'll call real progress in terms of light at night. And you consider 146 years really is not that long compared to the 300,000 years that we've been around, where for all those years it was really, really dark at night. So the question too is, like, we live where we're awake during the day and we sleep at night, but not every species does that. There's a lot of animals that have to have the darkness at night. So what are the consequences of light pollution? The first is light trespass. Light goes where it's not really intended, where it's not really needed. And all of the energy that it takes to get that light there is just totally wasted. Glare, if you look very carefully on the right side of the slide, you can actually see 2 people. You see their legs, but as It's like when someone shines a flashlight in your eye, you don't see very well. Another issue is using more light than you need. And when you talk about more light, if we consider what we have when we have a full moon, it provides 2/100ths of a foot candle level of illumination. It's not a lot, but if we were out in a field, we would be able to see where that path is, the boulder that's there that we have to walk around. You don't really need a lot of light, and even in this room, with the lights all turned out, and just having the lights along the side, look how much illumination there is in terms of our ability to see because our eye adjusts to darkness. And another issue is sky glow, where in 1988, the International Dark Sky Association, which is currently renamed as Dark Sky International, was formed by astronomers who were very concerned about the fact that they were no longer able to see the night sky even through their telescopes. So why do we want to reduce light pollution? Well, it has adverse consequences on human health, on animals, on plants. It interferes with that astronomical observation. We have energy waste, which we'll talk about that a little later, but there's a lot of competition now that there wasn't before for light at night and the energy that it takes. And the question too of whether or not future generations have a fundamental right to see the majesty of the night sky. So a little bit of history on light pollution. This is a rendition of what light pollution would have been like in 1950. By 1975, 1997 with no LEDs on the market yet. And today, LEDs have produced a tremendous amount of light that causes light pollution because of the amount of blue wavelength light, and we'll get into that a little later. But that blue wavelength light has a higher propensity for bouncing off of air particulates and coming back down as light pollution. This is a scale that's been developed to represent what the night sky looks like in different settings. So where you have that inner city at a rating of 9, you don't really see anything. You might see a planet, but you don't really see much in the way of stars. And then all the way at the other end at 1, you have a pristine night sky with no interference at all. And what about energy waste? We spend $3 to $7 billion every year on unneeded lighting. And sometimes unneeded lighting doesn't pertain necessarily to the fact that the light is here and we're trying to light, let's say, the sidewalk. What it means is that we don't really direct the light to the sidewalk. Instead, we're lighting the sidewalk and all the grass and those trees over there, all from that one light because the light's not being properly directed. Here's an example of sports field lighting where you just throw the light up and you don't really have much in the way of any light control, as opposed to the case where there's a company that's actually developed outdoor lighting so that it's pretty precise within 10 feet of that boundary of where that field of play is. It gets dark. So especially where you have field lighting in adjacent areas where you have surrounding your homes and things like that, you want to try and minimize light pollution. So wasted energy represents, it's 380 terawatts every year. It's enough to power 35 million homes. It's represented by wasted outdoor lighting. 99% of the light, and this comes from the U.S. Department of Energy in 2022, 99% of outdoor lighting doesn't really contribute to the intended function that that light is there for. it's wasted. And from an annual emissions standpoint, we have 246,000 gigawatt hours of energy that's consumed by outdoor lighting. And the amount of CO2 emissions that's caused by that require 3.8 billion tree seedlings to be planted each year and then have grow for 10 years to compensate for that CO2 emission. So what can we do with solutions? Because we certainly can identify the problem, but maybe it's important to identify solutions as well. And using dimming controls and motion sensors are probably the two best ways that we can control and minimize light pollution. One of the areas that we talked about was the consequences for wildlife. So you have habitat disturbance, you have their behavioral, and you have their survival. There are about 2 billion migratory birds that die every year, many of which are directly affected by light pollution. One of the statutes that was passed in 2023 was to turn the state facilities' lights out from 11 o'clock at night until 6 in the morning. And that started out as a bill for migratory bird behavior, so that reducing that light at night would help them in terms of navigating by stars instead of navigating by light pollution that was coming from the ground. Then the question becomes, how many animals are nocturnal? Some of the species, like the bat species, 100% of them are nocturnal. And then on the other end, you have primates like us, where about a third, 30% of them are nocturnal. So there's a lot of nocturnal life out there, and some of it has direct relationship to our food chain. So it affects us, even though, let's say, that insect or that bumblebee may be nocturnal. It still affects us if they aren't able to properly work with their seeds and whatnot and get pollen and whatnot. So artificial light at night will both attract and repulse insects and animals. Sea turtles are one example. In Florida, they've actually passed laws that require shielding of lights, any facility that's even close to the beach area, because the turtles will bury their eggs in the sand, and then when they hatch, the baby turtle comes out and starts hopefully going towards the water, but they're really following the light. And if instead they find parking lot light, they start going to the parking lot and they end up dying from exhaustion. It also affects fish. Salmon migration, for example, 40% greater likelihood of predator problems from areas that are polluted with light, because the predator can see better where that salmon is migrating. And they did a story that came out in a number of publications about the devastating role of light pollution in terms of our insect population. And I remember as a little kid, in the backyard, we had 3 acres, there were tons and tons and tons of fireflies. And it's like a little show at night. But although they're still around, the numbers are dwindling significantly. It disturbs, the light pollution disturbs their mating rituals. And so there's been publications, this is from The Guardian, about how climate change is killing fireflies. And a lot of that has to do with light pollution. With insects, it disrupts their normal flight activity. It attracts insects that don't normally move from their habitat. And the loss of insect population is detrimental to us as well. Because if we lose those pollinators, what does that do for flowers and plants and so forth? So we get into the issue of how light affects plants. It gets pretty interesting how plants respond to light. Take a tree. Here's an example where you have a street light on the left, and all of the leaves that are basically turned color and ready to fall off, they haven't fallen off yet because they're close to the light. But the part of the tree where the leaves are further away from the light, they've all basically dropped from the tree. So that gives you a good idea of how light affects plants, trees. And we talked about the pollinators. The bumblebee in 7 states is completely gone. U.S. Fish and Wildlife determined that endangered species basically constitute, let's say, that bumblebee, and whether or not they should be protected is currently in debate, but there is some serious consideration right now to listing them as an endangered species. Light pollution is a serious factor. A third of all of our food requires a pollinator, and many plants and flowers are pollinated by nocturnal insects or small animals, moths, bats, operating in the night environment. When we alter the light condition, then we further unravel our web of life if that pollination stops. And what about us? How does light affect us at night? It turns out that it has significant effect on us. As I mentioned earlier, we've only had the light at night for about 146 years to any significant degree. It has a disruptive effect on our circadian rhythm, melatonin, and more federal grants are out there now that are directed at light at night research. The American Medical Association has done 2 reports on light at night. The first one was done in 2009, where they recommended that all street lighting be shielded, and they were looking primarily at that point at light in the urban setting where street lights would be shining into people's apartments. They also did a study in 2016 that recommended using low correlated color for light to reduce the amount of light pollution and the effects that it has on the human health. In 2009, we talked about the fact that the streetlights need to be fully shielded, and that's especially for people that are vision impaired, and as they get older, as I get older, I find I too am more sensitive to light at night, to the point that I remember when LED headlights first came to market. I can remember driving down the road, and as an LED headlight would be approaching me, my eyes would be sending me a message that says, this is not good, you know, and I would be squinting. There's a correlation between light at night and heart disease, and there was a study that was done last year that showed a correlation between levels of light pollution and memory issues as you get older. So color temperature is extremely important in terms of reducing light pollution. One of the issues with correlated color temperature that I mentioned earlier has to do with the blue wavelength light. And the way that the correlated color temperature works is, I hit the wrong button, is that you can go all the way from, let's say, a low of 1700, which is that really sort of orangey light, all the way down to the bottom where you have 15,000 to 2,700, which is the kind of light that you have on a clear day and a blue sky. The more Kelvin temperature rating that you have, the higher the blue wavelength light. So the trick is to try and stay in that around 2700 Kelvin. And in today's market, if you go to Home Depot and you look at a light bulb that's in a package, you'll actually see that they all now have Kelvin ratings. So getting a 2700 Kelvin rating light is important. We don't advocate not lighting at all at night, but if you are going to light it, the trick is to do it in a way that minimizes the light pollution. And what about curfews? Building codes that are developed nationally and then adopted by the states, including Connecticut, are all coming out with things like commercial buildings are not allowed to have light on after 1 hour after closing, or they have to turn out all landscape lighting from 11 o'clock until 5 in the morning. And these codes are now becoming more universally adopted. One example of what we could do here in Suffield has already been done in Pittsburgh. We have, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, but we have about, say, 50 to 60% of the streetlights in Suffield are absolutely positively unneeded from the perspective of safety in terms of traffic control and crash avoidance. And just as a reference, I've been on the roadway lighting committee that sets the standards for North America for roadway lighting for 12 years and worked with them on developing policies. But I will tell you that some of the things that we do are reactionary with the simple assumption that more light equals more safety, but it's not true. And what they did in Pittsburgh, there's technologies out there that would say, all right, if you want to leave the light on all night long, how about at maybe 11 o'clock, we dim it down so that it drops 50% of the output. It's still there, but it's not as bright as it was. The technology is there also to turn it off completely, so that at 11 o'clock it goes off and at 5 in the morning it comes back on. And that saves a lot of energy. Developing a streetlight master plan is critical. Why? Right now, somebody comes to the town engineer and says, hey, I want a streetlight. You know, my neighbor 2 doors down, he's got one, I want one too. And if he's persistent enough, maybe the town engineer just says, all right, we'll put it in. But do we really need it? No. What are they looking for? They're looking basically for illumination of their yard at the town's expense. If you have a streetlight master plan and warranting policy in place, then the town engineer has something to fall back on and says, well, we'd love to help you, but these are the conditions that have to exist in order for us to justify using a streetlight. You don't have that, we can't do it, I wish we could. But you have a hard time doing that if you don't have the master plan in place. And with the master plan, you can also, if you're really interested in pursuing it, you can form an advisory committee to go out and do an audit and say, all right, here are the 10 conditions under which a streetlight is warranted. Let's audit every single one of them, and let's set aside all of those lights that don't meet at least one condition and consider taking them down. And so we all assume that every streetlight is necessary, but that assumption really isn't true. There's a lot of them there. One thing in Suffield, in 1987, there was a horrific murder. It took place on a new development that didn't have streetlights. And it involved a conflict between a local and people that had just moved in, their sons, and there was a murder. And the bottom line was that the Planning and Zoning Commission then decided to put in a new rule that said if you're going to develop property, you have to do half-code lighting. What does that mean? That if the standards in the Roadway Lighting Committee document say you should be putting in a street light every 200 feet, put one in, skip one, put one in, skip one. The Roadway Lighting Committee looked at that and said that it actually would be safer not to light the road at all. But nonetheless, we in Suffield, if you have a new development go in, it has to have half-code street lighting. Why? Because it was a reaction to that murder that took place that somehow said that if we put in a street light, maybe this wouldn't happen. It's totally irrational, but it's there. Another issue, what about the future of street lighting? I did a presentation at the Toronto meeting in the Roadway Lighting Committee in March that shows that there's new technology coming that will make street lighting that is dedicated to crash avoidance obsolete probably in about 15 years. It's radical, it's disruptive, it's going to change things in a way that none of us could have imagined 10 years ago. It's called connected vehicle technology. It's already underway. And what it does is it basically gets us to a point where cars are controlled by cellular communication that's installed both in the car and along the road. You won't have steering wheels, you won't have gas pedals, you won't have brakes. The cars will be all controlled themselves by cellular vehicle technology. And it's called the Intelligent Transportation System, and next week I do a presentation before the ITS committee here in Connecticut on how this ITS system is going to affect roadway lighting. You won't need roadway lighting on interstate highways at all. And if you were in an urban setting and you have a need for lighting so pedestrians can navigate the sidewalk, yes, you'll still need it. But where you have it truly dedicated to avoiding crashes, you won't need it. And the Federal Highway Administration published a document on saving lives with vehicle-to-everything technology, which is basically another term for that cellular vehicle technology. And their goal is to have 0 traffic fatalities. Right now we have about 33,000. In 20 years, we won't need street lights. And what about good outdoor lighting design? How do we do that? Well, the Illuminating Engineering Society and Dark Sky International got together about 5 years ago and came up with the 5 principles for responsible outdoor lighting. And what are they? And I have, by the way, some literature up here. If anybody wants to do a take-home, you can take one of the documents. So I've got that. But useful. Where is the light useful? Only use light where it's useful. Targeted, like we talked about the sidewalk. You want to light the sidewalk, that's fine. But you don't really need to light the grass and the trees that are nearby. How about low light levels? We're doing a project right now in our condo association at Bramble Ridge where we're using 40-watt equivalent lighting. It provides plenty of light. You don't really need a 100-watt or 150-watt light to be able to see where your driveway is and where the sidewalk is and things like that. Controlled, so that maybe using those motion sensors and the color part of it, which we talked about. But back on the control part, you know, sometimes there's an interest in providing security where people might feel safe if their yard is lit up. And what's amazing is that actually the most protection that you can get from lighting happens when you use motion sensor lighting, because then if you did have an unwelcome visitor with bad intentions walk onto your property, guess what? The light just comes on all of a sudden, and what is that message that gets sent by that? Maybe there's a camera that just took a picture. Do you think that person is going to continue, or they're going to run away? They're going to run away. So having that motion sensor lighting that stays off except if someone trips it is probably the most secure form of safety that you can have from lighting, as opposed to when you leave the light on all night long, what do? You provide a blueprint for anybody that comes onto your property of where your vulnerable points are. Where are those windows? Where are the doors? Entry points, all those things are all provided as a little roadmap by the fact that it's all lit up at night. Now, here in Suffield, we have two examples of things that are worth talking about in terms of good lighting. One building is typical in its style and function, but the outdoor lighting adds to its attractiveness. The other building is one of the most beautiful buildings in the whole state of Connecticut. And it's a place where outdoor lighting actually creates something that's truly spectacular. It's unique, it's outstanding. So the first one was built in 2002. It's the new high school over on Sheldon Street. Elaine Sarsinski was first selectman at the time, and we worked with Elaine on developing all the parking lot lighting that would be in place to make sure it was fully shielded. This was 2 years before the building code adopted these standards that would have required it. At this time, it wasn't required, but we did it anyhow. And when having that type of light, where it lights the road, but it doesn't create the glare, and it minimizes the light pollution, it actually adds to how pretty the building looks. The second building was built in 1972, and it was designed by a renowned architect. The outdoor lighting is a key architectural feature to the building. It is a spectacularly beautiful visual element in our Suffield night environment, and it is this library. Kent Memorial Library went in place of buildings that had been built in like the late 1800s, and they were stores that ended up getting torn down. This is in the historic district, so you can imagine the controversy of putting a building that wasn't really traditionally historic looking right in the middle of the historic district. But there's no direct light that's visible from the building. It's all indirect. There's no glare. And what the architect did is along the side of the building, he created these vertical lines that were intended to resemble the vertical lines of a traditional Suffield tobacco barn. And that's those stripes that you see in the picture along the side. Even in the front of the building, here you have a courtyard that's all lit up, but there's absolutely no dedicated light and light pole over there. All of the light is the indirect lighting that's coming off the building, but it provides plenty of light for people to be able to see where they need to go. So what about good neighbor lighting? So if you're a good neighbor, you light right, you light only when and where you need to light. And back to those responsible 5 principles, you shield the fixtures, you use the timers and motion sensors, use the least amount of light possible, and use it only when it's needed. And here's some examples of outdoor lighting that is fully shielded, where the light shines straight down, but doesn't go into the sky and onto adjacent properties. Some more examples there. Home Depot even did a section one time where they actually had good neighbor lighting as a 4-foot section in their store. And this goes back to the bird migration issue about keeping lights out at night to create the dark corridors that migratory birds need during the spring and the fall migratory season. So basically that's the summary of what this presentation is all about. There's contact information. If anybody has follow-up questions, you can send me an email, firstname@lastname.net. I've been with Dark Sky for about 25 years, on the board of directors for 12, Northeast Regional Director for 18 years. So there's a lot of information out there that is available, and I'd be happy to work with anybody. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer. I got to compete, by the way, with the ventilation system here in terms of hearing, so if you have a question, you have to talk up.
Hartford Current recently did an article.
Say
The
that?
Hartford Current recently did an article about your efforts with the state on the courthouses.
Yes.
Would you talk a little bit about that?
Well, one of the laws, there are actually two laws. One law was passed in 2006. It said that all state properties, you couldn't spend any state money for outdoor lighting unless the lighting was designed to minimize light pollution, maximize energy conservation, and if the light was 1,800 lumen or more, it had to be fully shielded. And then in 2023, they passed another law that said, the bird migratory one, about turning the lights out at 11 o'clock and not turning them back on until 6 in the morning. Well, in 2023, I wrote to the director of facilities management for the court system, noting the fact that the courts weren't really following the laws. And they're back, and I wrote a letter to their chief justice, never heard anything back. And so finally I wrote an email to the chief court administrator, and I said, look, you can't really pick which laws you're going to obey and which ones you're not. And so here you got statutes that say you have to do this. What can we do in working together to develop the kind of policies that need to be developed? And 9 days later, the chief court administrator declared that every light at every court facility throughout the state of Connecticut was essential for safety, therefore exempting it from the 11 o'clock shutoff. It was totally arbitrary. It was basically saying we're not going to obey. So in May, I filed a lawsuit against the Supreme Court and the chief court administrator for non-compliance, and that court case is right now working its way through the system. The state is trying to get the case dismissed, and we're trying to do what's called discovery, where they have to answer questions about what efforts did they make to comply with the law, things like that. But it'll be an interesting exercise.
Our daughter lives on a street in town. Our daughter lives on a street in town that has no streetlights. How is it determined which roads get streetlights?
That's an extremely good question, because what we're really dealing with here is the fact that we don't have a warranting policy that would be what we call an objective criteria to say, here are the conditions under which a streetlight is needed. So what ends up happening is we put in streetlights where they aren't needed because someone asks for them and they just want to get this off the table. Another issue has to do with the state implementation of street lighting, like on interstate highways. And what's very interesting is we have continuous lighting. I'll give you one example. I-91, 1984 and prior, no light at all from 91 in Hartford all the way up to the Springfield, Massachusetts line. Then they decided that we're going to widen the road to 3 lanes, in some cases 4 in each direction. And when they did that, they worked with the Federal Highway Administration with a program for reimbursement. And highway lighting qualifies for federal reimbursement at 100%. So what ends up happening is the state says, okay, let's light everything, right? And the federal government says, we'll pay for it all. You have to make us a promise that once we put these things up and we pay for it, that you'll take care of them. You'll maintain them. Like burns out, you'll take care of it. And so what ends up happening is, number one, there's never a question of whether you need the light or where you need it. Instead, it's like, hey, they're paying for it, just put them in. Now, what's interesting is for 30 years, the California Department of Transportation, known as Caltrans, has had a policy in place not to light their freeways. Instead, what they do is they have a very strict criteria for installing lights at proven points of conflict where their data shows that the crashes are occurring at 3 times greater rate than anywhere in terms of average. If you have a spot like that with 3 times greater crash rate, they will then consider putting in roadway lighting at that point, but nowhere else. And that's been in place for 30 years. If they can do it in California on their freeways, why can't we do it here? And the reason is, number one, the federal government reimburses us for everything, so no skin off our nose if we put all those lights in. And number two, if you're the engineer at the Department of Transportation here in Connecticut, if you light everything, who can criticize you? If you only light a little bit, what if an accident happens outside the scope of that lighted area? It's on you, right? So it's more for their own protection than it is for our protection, but that's a little bit of history on how roadway lighting gets to be as prolific as it is, and how interesting it will be in another 15 years when you have that controlled vehicle technology take over and you won't need roadway lighting anymore at all. Any other questions?
First, thank you for this information. I think it's very important. One of your slides talked about a town, I think it was in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, where they did dimmers, and you said Suffield could put dimmers on or turn lights off at certain times. Are there studies to show the break-even point between the cost of implementing that and when the savings from electricity, when you break even and start saving?
There's a company in Rhode Island that actually manufactures the equipment, and they have the studies that show where that break-even point is. One of the things to consider too is the fact that energy competition at night is radically changing, where back in the 30s and 40s you had generators, utility company generators pumping out all this electricity, but all the factories were closing down at 5 o'clock. And so what do they do with this energy that's being generated after 5 o'clock? Well, street lights were one answer. So let's put in lots of street lights and use that energy, because they can't stop the generator. They have to keep it going so that it's ready at 6 in the morning when the factory opens up. You take that situation over there, and then today, what do we have? We have two primary sources of energy consumption barreling down the road. One is artificial intelligence and data centers that are being built, where one of the major companies, I think it was Microsoft, actually bought a nuclear power plant to generate the energy that they need for their data centers. And then on top of that, as we get more and more into electric vehicles, each of us drives an electric vehicle, we bring it home. What do? You charge it. Where do you charge it? You charge it in your garage overnight, and that starts to drain that energy at night. Is it wise to, as that demand for energy increases, so will the price. So we need to take a look at using energy for streetlights where we don't really get the safety from them, and instead redirecting that energy over to places like data centers and electric car charging stations. That's a very good question.
Yeah. In your presentation, you clearly have done many things in Suffield through the years related to this. And you presented different things. What do you think are I'll say like the top 1 to 3 things that you think, like working with the first selectman of the town and so forth, that could be done in Suffield that would, have a significant help in the town?
Suffield, like any town, can look spectacularly beautiful if all the lighting is done right. It is warm, inviting. Even the color, that soft lighting is, when you think about a Marriott hotel, you're just driving into their parking lot, you don't see any direct light at all. It's all just that facade lighting, it's all indirect lighting, it's warm, it's inviting. So if you're looking for attractiveness, doing lighting the right way is the way to go. But the issue has to do with the fact that for the most part, exceptions like this are rare, where you have the library that had lighting installed as an architectural feature intended to be exactly what it is, as opposed to building the library and then saying, oh, by the way, we need lighting. What are we going to do about that? We'll stick a pole there, stick a pole there. Or in some cases, I worked with the superintendent of schools on issues that we don't want to have to dig a little channel and put electrical wiring in to stick a pole over there on the other side of the parking lot to light down. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a light and put it sideways and shine it way over there so that we don't have to do that. And when we put that light up like that, it doesn't just light the far side of the parking lot, it also lights the sky and across the street. And if you go up on Hill Street and look at the old school system, what was the old high school that's now the middle school, it's really a horrendous eyesore. And we can get to the point where the town can present itself in a beautiful way if we get to the point where we actually enforce what we have on the books. We have zoning regulations right now that say no light trespass. But when you go to the zoning enforcement officer, and I'm not criticizing them, they have all these balls in the air already. And you're coming to them to talk about light pollution? I mean, it's like, you know, almost like you need to hire another person, you know, so you don't get a lot of enthusiasm. The trick is to work with zoning and planning at the time when someone, a developer, comes and says, I want to apply for approval for this plan to do this development. If planning and zoning is at that point scrutinizing their outdoor lighting, and they say, wait a minute, you know, this lighting doesn't really meet our standards, that developer will do backflips for planning and zoning to do whatever light you want. You name it, you got it, right? And they'll do it right because planning and zoning's approval is conditioned upon it. But once planning and zoning approves it, and the light goes up, if it's not the right kind of light, it becomes extremely difficult to get them to undo that. So that's what the reality is. So planning and zoning is really a critical player.
Maybe just a follow-on comment to maybe just encourage people. 1 to 2 years ago, there was a house on a through street in Suffield that had tremendously obnoxious lighting up. It literally lit like this houses across the street out. It was a corner house, and every time I drove down the street, I just couldn't believe they were doing that. And I went to the building department, I told them which house it was. I said, I'm not a neighbor, but I said, I feel for the neighbors because the lighting there is just so unreal. And within a week, those lights were off. So it's, the building department, I mean, they care about the neighbors and so forth too, and at least in that case, I found that they helped.
Yeah.
I live in the city of Hartford. We've had a problem with light pollution in properties neighboring the building where I live. And I found the zoning ordinance does have controls on that, but the zoning ordinance generally is not enforced unless somebody files a complaint. They're not proactive at all about seeking problems. They wait for complaints to come in, but then they do respond. But what's we've uncovered as part of the problem is that when buildings put in new exterior lighting, they're supposed to file for a building permit, but very few of them ever do. And I think that a public awareness campaign needs to happen so that property owners know that they can't just go and buy a Klieg light and install it, that they have to file a lighting plan and get it approved before they install site lighting. But property owners don't realize that yet. And there's an education component that needs to happen in order for property owners to do the right thing.
There was a development in Glastonbury where they were going to put in this 5-story high apartment building, and abutters were single-family dwellings. And one of them got in touch with me, and they sent me the lighting plan that had been developed by a professional lighting contractor. And it called for, all lighting nowadays has what they call a bug rating. It stands for backlight, uplight, and glare. And if you're doing lighting in keeping with the building code, your uplight rating should be U0. Well, they were U1 and U2. So I call the guy that's the professional lighting designer and introduced myself and explained that you really needed U2 to be removed and instead substitute U0. And he agreed. And they resubmitted a plan and all the lighting was now U0. But you have to call them on that ahead of time, because once someone writes the check to buy all those lights and install all those lights, it becomes economically disadvantageous to have to take them all down and put something new up. But if you can catch it at an early stage, most people will do everything that they need to do to get that approval. So if putting in that U0 light fixture gets approval and takes that problem away, in a heartbeat, they'll do it.
Another question. I'm the chairman of the Historic District Commission, and we see a fair number of applications that involve lighting. You know, like maybe somebody has a new sign or something, maybe they're putting a garage and there's lights on it and so forth. I'm just listening to this, and you know, I could argue historically these, you know, traditionally there would have been no lights or maybe a lantern or something on the house, but you know, I could also argue that if somebody has lighting that's like lighting up the whole neighborhood, hey, that's not very historic, that's not really in the setting of the district. You know, so I can kind of take some of the ideas here that you've got and kind of watch for that a bit. Are there anything particular that you would suggest as far as the historic district?
You know, it's kind of hard to really deal with, you know, people. I don't blame them. I mean, it's like, this is my property. I get to do what I want, right? That's the attitude. But there is a middle ground that might say, for example, okay, you want to light your house. How about this? How about you light your house until, say, 10 or 11 o'clock at night? Because there's nobody out there driving around 11, 1, 2, 3 in the morning, right? It's not really doing you any good. So have curfews, right, that require them to showcase their house only up until 10 or 11 o'clock, and then turn it off. Even when you think about street lighting, we had a side street with it, I mentioned that development went in, and it wasn't just the owner, it was a cul-de-sac. And at 10 o'clock at night, the sidewalks rolled up. I mean, there was no traffic, none. But those street lights were on all night long, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, right? Why? Just because, well, no one ever said, hey, let's put in a control to turn them off. But there's just, these are just a few examples. But putting in those curfews, like telling that person that wants to showcase their house that they have to turn the light off at 10 or 11 at night, it's an excellent compromise, because now you get to showcase your house when people are looking, but you don't get to turn the lights on when no one's watching. Any other questions? Yep.
How far would we have to drive to get a really good view of the night sky? Somewhere.
Well, let's say this, there are places along the shore that where you can get a good view of the night sky. Not an excellent view, a good view. My wife Judy, you know, she would pick places where we would go on vacation, and one year I said, hey, it's my turn. And where did we go? We went to Four Corners, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, because it's one of the darkest places in the United States. And we actually slept that night on a rock, a big flat rock, right, with airbag and whatnot. And you could see the Milky Way literally rolling across the sky. It was phenomenal, right? But you really have to go to places like that to see something that's what we'll call exquisite.
The closest dedicated dark sky preserve is in Quebec, just north of Maine. That's the closest one to us.
Yeah, the International Dark Sky Association has a program in place where if you have an area like a park, you can get dark sky certification, where they'll actually come out and inspect how your lighting is, what levels of light and all this kind of stuff. And if you have done your lighting right, you can get dark sky certified. Thank you, everybody. Well, there is literature up here on things just like the responsible outdoor lighting and other pamphlets, so if anybody wants anything, please feel free.